Hello, welcome back to the Robert E. Howard Foundation channel. Tonight we're going to be taking the first part of our look at the stories of Solomon Kane, Robert E. Howard's Puritan adventurer, and his first, well, if you don't count the Demontour werewolf felt person, his first character that he actually had a series going with. We are going to take a look at the origins of Solomon Kane, and then we are going to take a look at the first five stories in the Del Rey, the Savage Tales of Solomon Kane book. Bobby, would you like to? Oh, sorry, let me introduce everybody. Making their return to the channel are Bob Byrne and Bobby Derie, and our new person tonight is Tim Brandt. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. This is awesome.
All right, Bobby, take it away.
Okay, so in 1923, a guy named W.C. Tuttle published a story called Sir Pegan Passes in the 10 August 1923 copy of Adventure Stories. And Adventure was a very popular pulp magazine. It ran all sorts of westerns and all that sort of stuff. And in that story was a character called Solomon Kane. And this Solomon Kane was a very Jewish coded character. He wasn't stated to be Jewish, but he was a usurer, and his name was Solomon. And the funny part about that is that the story was adapted to film three times, twice in Howard's lifetime. In Man in the Rough in 1928, and The Cheyenne Kid in 1933, and then The Fargo Kid in 1940. And every single time they changed that character's name because they didn't want him to be an anti-Semitic stereotype. But we figure that Robert E. Howard read that story because he was reading Adventure religiously and he liked the name. So he picked up the name. And at that time, and I'm talking about 1928, okay? So it's been 2 years since Robert E. Howard's been published in Weird Tales. His last story was Wolf's Head in 1926. Wolf's Head is a follow-on from his first story, In the Forest of Ill Fair, with this guy named Demontour, who's a werewolf. And you have him, a duelist in Africa. And, the story goes from France in the Forest of Ill Fair to Africa in Wolf's Head. So in 1928, when he's putting together a story he calls Solomon Kane, which was published as Red Shadows, okay, Solomon Kane is basically retracing the steps of those first two stories because the story starts with Solomon Kane in France and then he goes to Africa. And I think H.P. Lovecraft really got to the heart of the character when he wrote to Henry Kuttner in 1936. Solomon Kane reflected another side of Tugut, the brooding ethical sense which made him furious over injustices and oppressions. How he used to storm over the maltreatment of prisoners by policemen, the high-handed outrages of absentee oil corporations in Texas, and latterly the absorption of Abyssinia by Italy. Lovecraft's putting this in his own terms, but it's very true when you read that first story. Solomon Kane is this wandering character who is driven by injustice. And in that way, he's sort of a prototype for what Conan would be, because each of the stories in the Solomon Kane saga is standalone. There's a loose continuity, but for the most part, it's not like this one happens and then this one happens and then this one happens. It's wherever he wants Solomon Kane to be, whatever story he wants to tell, Solomon Kane is there to be the hero, to drive the action, to seek justice. And that's what you get when it's first published in Weird Tales in 1928. Of course, it didn't start out being published. First, he wrote the story and then he decided to submit it to Argosy. And Argosy rejected it, but Argosy rejected it in a very interesting way. Did you want to talk about that, John?
But let me see. So Bob got this handwritten letter back from one of the associate editors at Argosy All Story. Now, Bob had been able to sell one story to Argosy. Uh, Actually, that may have been after that he wrote the crowd horror that came after this. So this would have been before the crowd horror. But the associate editor was so impressed with the story and with what Bob had done in writing it that he decided he would write a handwritten 4-page letter to Bob. And this is what the letter states: February 20th, 1928. Dear Mr. Howard, in some ways the story is very good, and in others it is rotten. I think you may have the stuff if you get steered right, and for that reason am going to hand out the why and wherefore in detail that the story was turned down. It starts out as a period story and finally changes into a combination modern and medieval of African jungle story. You can't mix periods and atmospheres like that. Stick to one or the other. Your story is disconnected, partly because of that same wandering from one period to another. There is too much that is unfinished or unexplained, and too much that is miraculous. For instance, it would seem rather incredible to a reader that the wolf would not return through the secret passage of the cave and attempt to recover part of his loot. Then there is absolutely no connection between the first and second parts. In one jump, you change from the Middle Ages to Eugene O'Neill jungle stuffs with no explanation save a vague intimation that there has been some kind of a pursuit. If there has been such a chase or hunt, you can't omit it from your story. The stuff pulled by the shaman is good, but you can't let it go as an unexplained miracle. Unexplained miracles are easy to write, but the reader soon tires of them. What the readers want, and incidentally is hard to write, is miracle stuff which can be explained to them by one means or another. One thing more. As a general rule, conversation and descriptive matter should not be included in the same paragraph. You seem to have caught the knack of writing good action and plenty of it in your stories. If you guard against the faults I have outlined, I believe your stuff will be saleable and will be interested in seeing some of it. Good luck. S.A. McWilliams, Associate Editor. P.S. I owe you an apology for not returning your manuscript sooner. I wanted to send a personal letter with it, however, and was not able to get time to write it before, owing to the unusually large number of stories we are receiving just now, about 100 per day. As a consequence, this manuscript of yours has been lying here on my desk untouched for the last 2 weeks. I hope you will pardon the delay. So as you can see, that was very rare for an associate editor at one of the big pulp magazines to have done a handwritten multi-page letter to a writer that he doesn't know anything about, doesn't have any relationship with, telling the guy, hey, you got a good story here, but these are the problems with it. Fix this stuff and you can sell this. So what do you guys think?
Which Howard then ignored and just sent into Weird Tales exactly. I
Yeah.
understand why, but I find that hilarious, sort of.
It is.
The rare exception that, he got this letter and the 100 a day floored me. I mean, I get the pulp back then, but Argosy just sifting through 100 stories a day, week after week after week. I'm amazed anybody who wasn't a name already known was in there, like Bedford Jones or whoever it might have been. But then, I assume Howard, took that to heart, besides just saying, wow, this was really nice. And he mentioned, that in the letter, he said, hey, I got this letter. This was cool. And then he just sent it off to Farnsworth saying, take it and publish it. Some humor in that.
Howard always struggled with the big pulps like Adventure and Argosy because he liked his historical adventure, but he wasn't a historian. He liked his exotic locales, but he didn't have any firsthand knowledge of those places. He wasn't really big on hard-boiled detective stuff. So he missed a lot of the key genres, and he couldn't quite hit the prosaic plots the same way that the editors liked. One thing I do want to mention about that letter, he talks about Eugene O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill was a playwright, extremely popular during the 1920s and 30s, and he largely wrote these plays that were about Black people, like Emperor Jones and All God's Children's Got Wings. And these were very socially aware plays. They're not all politically correct by today's standards, but they were, about Black people and racial issues, and they were sort of progressive in a sense. I won't say that they were hugely progressive, but in a sense, they were at least addressing these issues. And that's sort of key because Solomon Kane's most famous adventures all happen in Africa. And Robert Howard didn't know anything about Africa starting out, and he didn't know a lot about Africa by the time he ended. But how he creates the African characters in these stories is very important for how he develops Black characters later. Because when Howard is writing in a contemporary setting like the southwestern United States in Black Canaan or Pigeons from Hell, the Black people act very differently. They're acting like they're in desegregated United States culture in the 1930s at the time. These characters that are in a colonial but pre-colonized Africa, they're indigenous. So you've got these very strong colonialist stereotypes. You've got cannibals. You've got these very servile blacks. Every other story, they're mistaking Solomon Kane as a god because he's a white guy with firearms. But, at the same time, while Solomon Kane has these, vaguely white supremacist attitudes and very patronizing attitudes, he's at the same time saying, no, I'm not a god. I'm just a dude. And you see that again and again through the stories. And that's very important because when you get to the Conan tales, the Hyborian Age is the same kind of thing, except they're much less servile. He's gotten much better at writing Black people so that when Conan encounters a Black person, they don't think he's a god. All right, Queen of the Black Coast, they think she's a goddess, but they don't think he's a god. And he's much better at it when he gets to the Conan stories, but it's because he was developing those ideas back here, all the way back in the Solomon Kane tales. So keep that in mind while we're reading these. They're not going to be the most racially correct stories you've ever read. Some of them are going to be downright offensive, but they're important literally for us to see how these characters were being portrayed and how he developed those characters later on.
All right.
Okay, having just talked about all of that, let's get into the first story.
Yeah. Anybody have anything else to say at this point?
Yeah, Eugene O'Neill is kind of a very limited view. I've heard the name, but I've certainly never read any of his plays or anything. I think of it as if he was told, or now someone was told, you started out with the Three Musketeers and you went over here to Rudyard Kipling. And he said, don't do that. And it didn't bother me. I mean, he did a chase, and that would have been another however many chapters of the chase, and it's a pulp story. So, that's all right. But obviously that bothered the editor.
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to Red Shadows, because the editor kind of missed what he was criticizing of that in the story. The book, the Del Rey book, The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane, was edited by Rusty Burke. And Patrice Louanet did the 3 Conan volumes. And Patrice decided to do the Conan tales in the order that Howard wrote them. Rusty did not do that with the Solomon Kane book. He's got them somewhat out of order. And that the first story that we will look at, the first story in the book, is Skulls in the Stars, which was probably the second story of Solomon Kane that Howard wrote. He wrote Red Shadows and Solomon Kane. I'm sorry, Red Shadows and Skulls in the Stars, according to a list he gave to his friend Tuvis Clyde Smith in late 1927, so that he could send them in to the pulps. So who would like to take a look at Skulls in the Stars, or talk on Skulls in the Stars?
Tim, you want to jump in? Since Bobby and I immediately took over everything, which is what we do when we're on calls. So,
well, as a matter of fact, Skulls in the Stars is actually one of my favorite Solomon Kane stories that I've read, which is weird because a lot of times when people talk about this, they kind of lump it in towards the bottom of the list. I think it's a wonderful way to open this book, because even though it might not be like the best Solomon Kane story, I think it gives a very interesting first glimpse of the character. He's just described as this, dark-clad Puritan, striking off down this road, and then this kid wanders up to him and is like, "Hey, mister, you don't want to go down there. Bad stuff happens down there." And in the nicest way possible, Solomon Kane's like, "Kid, don't bother me. I know what I'm doing." And he heads off down the creepy road where all the bad stuff is said to have happened. And I have to make a mild confession here when I say that I am not the hugest fan of Howard's horror. I think he could do very good horror stories, but I think they're kind of few and far between. When he puts the elements of horror into his adventure stories and fantasy stories, I think it works slightly better as opposed to when he's just writing pure horror. And the descriptions of Solomon Kane walking down this marshy road in the dead of night, and just the atmosphere, the swamp fog, and the noises of the insects, and he hears this screaming going on somewhere in the distance, this inhuman wailing, and then all of a sudden this lacerated human being jumps out in front of him, falls to the ground dead in front of him. It's so creepy, and this was the first Robert E. Howard story that I read after getting off my Conan kick, well, which is what started me off on his bibliography. And so, I was there. This story hooked me in a major way. I was like, this is awesome. This is more of what I want from this writer. I don't know if you guys agree, but
Oh no.
The irony, John, there's 4 people on this call, and 2 of us aren't really into the horror of Robert E. Howard. That is mildly. John was just like, "Oh, got another one." I too not as big on the horror stuff, but that's me as a genre. But John has been hearing that for a couple years from me, and for you to throw that out was kind of funny.
Bob, you've been saying for years that you're going to do for Blackgate a big series of posts on the Solomon Kane stories, and you've been saying, let's do this. So, you got to talk about horror when you talk about Solomon Kane. So
That's true. That is true.
But
and this very much is a horror story. And it's one of Howard's, I won't say it's his best horror story, but it's one of his most memorable horror stories because of the moment when Solomon Kane is wrestling with the ghost. And he's thrown his weapons aside and he's just grasping with air. And his courage becomes a weapon against the spirit's hate and wins. And that's just one of the most beautiful scenes that he ever wrote. I think when we had our big horror write-up session a little while ago for Halloween, we all agree that that was awesome. So yeah, I think you're right on the money when you say this is a great horror story. He wrote more adventure stories with Solomon Kane, but especially in some of these early ones, he's experimenting with genre and style, because he was writing these for Weird Tales, and he had to have a weird element in there.
And I love the fact that you bring up him wrestling the ghost, because when I had a few more of these Solomon Kane stories under my belt, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he asked me what Solomon Kane was like as a character, and I told him the best way I know how to describe Solomon Kane is that in the first story I read of his, he wrestles a ghost and wins, and he was like, okay, so this is something worth reading. And I'm like, yeah.
when we did our look at the Skulls and the Stars for the horror, I read out this quote from him when the boy was telling him, don't go to the moors. They're bad things in the moor. It's horrible. It's killing people. And he says, these things be deeds of some power of evil. The lords of darkness have laid a curse upon the country. A strong man is needed to combat Satan in his might. Therefore I go, who have defied him many a time. And that is Solomon Kane and his thinking, although as we're going through these other stories, he gives some more details on what his thinking is, what his quest is. And I'm starting, as I'm rereading these stories, I'm starting to get a little bit different of the guy. I'm thinking, because I don't know who it was that came up with the description of Conan being a murder hobo, but I'm starting to think, Solomon Kane is pretty much like that. In most of these stories, he's like, somebody's doing evil, I got to go kill this person. So,
Shout out to Joseph Reed's books. Thank you, Joseph, for coming up with that.
If somebody starts throwing out God's Avenger, that's generally where you end up going down that path. That's kind of a natural progression.
Oh yeah.
It is important to say though that we never get an origin story for Solomon Kane. We get very little about his past. We never learn where he learned his swordsmanship. But we get these little snippets of his life. We know he's a wandering adventurer. We know he goes for justice and fights supernatural evil. And at one point, he was a buccaneer and in the military, but we never get the whole story of everything about him. And I think that's very much on purpose. This is the prototype for Conan. I keep saying it's the prototype for Conan, but he really is, because he wasn't the exact first series character that Howard ever came up with. That would be El Borak. But El Borak didn't get the series jumping off to the start. He couldn't sell El Borak getting started off. The Demontor stuff sizzled out after 2 stories. Solomon Kane hit in part because he just walked onto the page and owned the story. And he was the first character that Howard had that could really do that. And I think this is a good story to start off the collection. I think Rusty was trying to group these not chronologically as they were written, but related to how they
geographically as
yeah.
he's going, because the first 2 stories, well, actually, yeah, the first 2 stories take place in England, around Torkertown, and then Red Shadows, he's in France, and then I can't remember. I think he's in
Rattle
Germany
of Bones
for,
is Germany.
yeah. So I think that was the idea that Rusty had in grouping the stories as he did, was he was going for the geographical locations.
Yeah.
No, I was going to read. It was what Tim was kind of talking about, the excerpt that there above the dead man's torn body, man fought with demon under the pale light of the rising moon, with all the advantages with the demon, save one. And and now we're getting into Kane. I mean, that's right, save one, and that's where it turns. And that one was enough to overcome all the others. For if abstract hate may bring into material substance a ghostly thing, may not courage, equally abstract, form a concrete weapon to combat that ghost? And it goes on a little more, and he finishes the last one with for man's only weapon is courage that flinches not from the gates of hell itself, and against such not even the legions of hell can stand. So it's completely shifted. We know Kane is the sword guy and he's got a gun, and he's never, he even says he's afraid occasionally, but he's always charging forward. But it's laid out here. It's Kane's righteousness that is winning this fight. And it's laid out, in chapter 1 of the first story when things aren't looking great. And I think the prose and the word selection and the writing in the first couple Kane stories is better than stuff he did in Conan. I think his description of stuff, like Tim was talking about through the moor, and maybe not the stuff with the hand, but even in Rattle of Bones, I really like his writing style in the Kane stories.
Yeah, it was it should have probably said, but I'll probably put that up. But there will be spoilers for these stories, folks. So if you're interested, stop the
We
video
didn't
and
say
go
how
read
it
the
ended
stories.
yet, so
But we find out that the ghost is the
now we find out.
mentally handicapped brother, or I'm sorry, cousin of the mean old miser who lived in the swamp, who the miser got tired of dealing with him and caring for him, and killed him and left his body inside an empty tree. And when Solomon Kane found all of this out, he went to go exact his vengeance upon the cousin Ezra, which, a good name for, miserly cousin Ezra.
Cousin Ezra stuffing people in trees.
And we have it. Anything else we want to say about this story?
This, it's a horror ghost story, and the planes, the only thing he's talked about. But to me, because you know me, it shifts. It's a mystery story because he while he's fighting, and granted he's told the answer by the ghost while they're fighting, which I always thought was a little bit, but it's off camera, if you will. But he solves the mystery of what the problem is on the planes, and what's going on, and what this thing is and who's killing it. And then, a la Nero Wolf, he brings everybody together And instead of, he doesn't have a room here, they go to the miser's place, and Solomon Kane unveils it with a speech the same way that Nero Wolfe does at the end of his cases, and reveals the villain. There's a, to me, and especially from my roots, a mystery aspect of this that goes with it being a horror story. So it's a weird menace mystery when you put the whole thing together, I think. And he's willing to be judge and jury. I think Sherlock Holmes said, I would rather play havoc with the laws of England and with my own conscience. And Solomon Kane with the murder hobo thing takes that sort of a different direction, but it's the same concept that Kane decides to mete out his own justice to this guy and bring closure to the ghost, and he does, by golly.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kane never really gives a damn about the law of the land. Yeah, he doesn't kowtow to authorities. He doesn't deal with cops. He's usually in a place where if he's not just completely blundering in and killing people, then there is no law whatsoever to stop him anyway.
Was the poem, was it Homecoming, or the other long poem where he basically, he's ordered to do what he's ordered? He's like, screw you.
Oh yeah, it's
that's the other one.
Yeah, it's
That's
the one sin or the
Robert Green's steel drum.
The One Black Stain and the Return of Sir Richard Grenville. Yeah.
Sir Richard Grenville. That is absolutely the, authority be damned, and to the absolute extent of basically banishment.
Yeah.
It's very much something that would, reoccur with the Conan series, where it's always, anytime you throw the character into like a social situation, it's always the main character of against authority. It's always the main character against whatever law, whatever customs is there. And which is kind of interesting, because I always see Solomon Kane as like a slightly more civilized version of Conan, almost, because, he's not necessarily a barbarian. He's a Puritan. He's well-spoken. Obviously, he's read the Bible, so he's kind of a, I don't know, he's a slightly more refined character than Conan, but he has that screw you to authority that Conan, and by extension, most of Robert E. Howard's protagonists have. So it's very in character for the writer, at least, and I really appreciate that.
We when we did Queen of the Black Coast for our Conan stuff, the scene with Conan and the judge ordering him to turn over his friend, we discussed that and got some humor out of that as well, because that was very Conan way of dealing with authority. Not kowtowing in any way, shape, or form.
Right. And
that was coming straight out of Howard's letters with Lovecraft, where they would talk about, the law and the overreaches and police brutality, and he worked that into his Conan stories, but it was there earlier, before they even met.
Solomon Kane's very much an Old Testament Puritan, not a New Testament.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
100% fire and brimstone. Yeah.
We could go on about Howard in the Old Testament, but that's a different podcast.
Well, in this discussion on Skulls and the Stars is with Howard's notes that he wrote to Clyde Smith on all of his writing. And he sets out all of the stories he wrote and what he did with them. And so for 1927, we have his entry for Solomon Kane, which became Red Shadows. And then underneath it, Skulls and the Stars, No Thought short story, Solomon Kane, Ghostly Vengeance. So he didn't think too much of this story himself, sadly, because it is a good, very wonderful little horror story, mystery story. So next we move on to The Right Hand of Doom, which was written in early 1928. And we have one draft left in our collection of Robert E. Howard's typescripts. And according to Patrice, that means that Bob only wrote one draft for the story. So that's interesting.
He didn't sell this to Weird Tales. He might not have submitted it to Weird Tales. I don't remember. But it is one of those odd stories that reads more like a late Conan story than anything else, because Solomon Kane plays a very limited role in it. This is really story where Solomon Kane wanders into it, but he's not the main driver. So it's a very odd story in that respect.
And it's about
It's
that long. It's
yeah,
6.5 pages. It's a really short. It's almost like a scene, not a story.
Yeah,
yeah.
according to his notes to Tevis Clyde Smith, he said he did submit it to Weird Tales, so it was apparently rejected by Farnsworth. So
This honestly feels like a weird little play to me, like more than a Solomon Kane short story.
now the setup for the story is that a man walks into a tavern and he's flush with money, so he starts.
Sorry, that's a great setup. Yeah, so Puritan walks into a tavern.
So he offers to buy drinks for everybody with this money that he's got in his bag, and he offers a drink to Solomon Kane, and Solomon Kane doesn't want any part of it because this guy is boasting. John Redley is boasting about how he double-crossed the necromancer Roger Simeon and turned him into the authorities, and Roger Simeon's going to be hanged in the morning. And Solomon Kane was, his personal sense of morality was offended by this guy double crossing and turning in somebody that was trusting him. And so they both go to bed in separate rooms, which is interesting coming into the later Rattle of Bones story. And Solomon Kane is awoken by sounds he's hearing. So he goes out and goes into the hallway and goes into the next room, which is John Redley's. And as he opens the door, he sees the windows open and he sees what he takes to be a giant spider on the ledge of the window that jumps in and comes crawling across the floor and jumps on John Redley and kills him. And when Solomon Kane gets enough light to sees it's a human hand that has strangled John Redley, and I can't remember whether it broke his neck or not.
Mhm.
And so at that point, the innkeeper comes running up saying, "What's all the noise?" Sees what's going on, screams. And Solomon Kane stabs the lifeless hand and throws it in the fire. And as he's throwing it in the fire, he sees that there's a silver ring on one of the fingers, and it's a huge, hairy hand. So he gets up in the morning and heads over to Torkertown because the tavern's apparently several miles away from Torkertown, where Simeon is going to be hanged. And he gets there too late for the hanging. But as he is talking to the onlookers, they tell him that Roger Simeon during the night scared one of the guards into cutting off his right hand, or else he would curse the guard. And he threw the right hand out the window and started making chants. And they said that in the morning when they had him on the hangman's gibbet and were about to hang him, that he started acting crazy and started moving his right arm around like he was grabbing something and fighting with something. And then he started laughing and was laughing all the way till they hung him. And so at that point, Solomon Kane asked the person, what did Roger Simeon look like? What his hands look like? He says, "Oh, big hairy hands," and he had a very prominent silver ring on one of the fingers. So Simeon was able to work his revenge on John Redley through his black magic arts. What do y'all feel about this story?
When you describe it that way, this seems a little sillier than what I was just reading it.
There's a lot of charm in the telling because when they introduce Solomon Kane, it's the innkeeper saying, he's a man dangerouser than a wolf. And it's just a great line when it comes out as part of the story. But if you say it just straight out like that, it sounds a little silly. It's a very slight story. It's got a fable-esque quality to it. And it's very much Solomon Kane doesn't have much to do. He's there to see one part of the story, and he learns the other part of it when he gets to Torkertown. So there is that sort of putting the two bits together of the mystery, but it's a very basic, understandable mystery. Like, even if you did not have them tell you exactly what happened, you probably would have guessed why the giant hand was strangling the betrayer to death in his own room. You could probably guess about that. the big interest in this story for people that like the connections in Howard's tales is the ring on the warlock's hand,
Mm,
because it's supposed to be this coiled serpent ring. And it sounds very much like the description of Thoth-Amon's ring.
right.
The only difference is in this story, it's silver, and Thoth-Amon's is copper.
Oh.
And it's funny because Weird Tales had all these little small ads in the back of the magazine, and one of them was for a coiled serpent ring.
Hmm.
And we don't know if Howard actually saw that ad and got inspired and put it in his stories, or if he actually ordered it. But
Hmm.
it's fun to think that maybe he saw that and it's like, oh, this is cool, and worked it in because it was such a neat little widget. But yeah, very minor story, but it's a decent Solomon Kane story, just not a great one.
Yeah, find it interesting that this is one of the few stories where he doesn't kill anybody. So
The hand.
It feels like something that, I don't know. It seems to me like this is a story that Solomon Kane would just bring up in passing to
Around a
maybe like
campfire.
yeah, like years later, while he and someone else are traveling through the jungles of Africa, they come upon some big hairy spider, and the guy's like, "Oh man, you see the size of that spider?" And Solomon Kane's like, "You should have seen the spider I killed once. Let me tell you about it."
I mean, Kane clearly doesn't like. He's a snitch, but the dude was did black magic, diabolic arts. I mean, I, he turned in a necromancer who's a really bad thing at this time. So I don't have as much problem with Redley other than he's a little slime bag. But I mean, Kane is just absolutely offended. He's sort of in the snitches get stitches camp on this. And he really seemed little too indignantly affronted. I think that was warranted, but I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, you would think he'd be all
Oh,
for hanging necromancers, but I don't know.
Yeah, in general,
he
they were
was,
popular
but
among Puritans.
Howard was very, very, very big about personal connections and friendship in particular.
And he mentioned
Again,
friendship specifically, yeah.
Hmm.
think about Queen of the Black Coast. Why was the judge mad at him? Because he wouldn't give up his friend. Uh, and I really think that's all it was. It's just that, Kane answers to a higher law. Yeah, the warlock probably should have deserved death. And if Solomon Kane was there, he probably would have stabbed him
Yeah,
himself.
there you go.
But, he trusted you and you turned him in, you dirty bastard.
So I've got a row of Savage or Conan the Barbarian and Savage Tales back here, and I've not read the Savage Tales adaptation of this, which was not included in the reprint. So I know it's out there, and I would swear, and I looked for it the last couple of days online and didn't find it. I thought for sure this was adapted in one of the Conan the Barbarian comics that had him and Red Sonja in it, but I must be confusing it with a different dead necromancer that they found a body, and I'm pretty sure they cut off a hand because I read it
I thought
last
they
year.
cut off his head.
Was it his head? And
I thought it
then
was his head.
the necromancer ends up going back after the woman that betrayed him. So I'm probably mixing the two things, but I've not seen the Savage Tales version of this at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're mixing it up with a different story.
Probably so. Wouldn't spread. And I know Red Sonja was in it, and there weren't that many, but yes, I probably did.
it's been years since I read it, but Bobby, when did Clark Ashton Smith write The Return of the Sorcerer story?
Oh, that was like 1930,
Okay.
1931.
I would think that if he'd written that earlier, that possibly Howard had read that, and that might have influenced his writing on this and also the Rattle of Bones. But
No, Return of the Sorcerer was published in 1931.
okay,
So, no, it's. There were probably stories about the Mummy's Hand is the most famous one about a disembodied body part,
yeah.
but
Also know in the movies you had was it The Hands of Orlok and Mad Love with Peter Lorre with I guess Mad Love. You had the concert pianist who had his hands cut off and they replaced them with somebody else's hands, and a murderer's hands or something like that, and all that other silliness. But it seems to me that there may have been an earlier movie of that in the 1920s, something like that. That if
Seabury Quinn did a story like that too, but it was much later. The Red Gauntlets of Cizerne, which was the first ghost story to bust a ghost with a vacuum cleaner. But I'm getting far afield. But yeah, it's a trope in weird fiction. We'll put it
You
at
far
that.
afield with Seabury Quinn? Shocked, I say. Shocked. So this story is half the length of Skulls and the Stars and about a quarter of Red Shadows and a bit shorter than Rattle of Bones. This is a very, as Bobby said, a slight story. It's not one of my favorites at all, but it's really short. I mean,
and his note in his letter to Clyde Smith, he just gives the name Red Hand of Doom short story sent to Weird Tales. That's all he writes.
I mean, you could the one line summary, Kane stabs a hand. I mean,
Yeah.
that's as Bobby said, that's what Kane does in this story. He confronts a blowhard and stabs a hand and then travels to another town. So there's not a lot of description for that.
Yeah. One of those side quests.
Meh. Always do the side quests though.
They're worth more experience points than you think.
Uh,
All right. Anything else to say, or shall we move on to the big story of the five we're going to be looking at today?
Rattle the bone. No, I'm kidding.
All right. Red Shadows, or as it was originally titled by Bob Solomon Kane. Who would like to talk about this story?
I just want to open on it. I think this is epic. Like this to me is epic Robert E. Howard. The fact that, the editor of Argosy didn't like that there wasn't a transition between I like Skulls and the Stars, but to me, this is the Howard that I really got into. Tim, I came to Howard relatively late among all the people. So like you, I was, catching up on stuff and I was reading the Canes. I was like, oh, okay, it's epic. It's got as I made a comment, it's the story that later we'll see the mightily thewed barbarian doing this kind of adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't really run across the term historical fantasy that much. And, I've read a little bit of Scott Odin's stuff that kind of fits in that category. I like that because it's not fantasy like might do my Dungeons and Dragons and my Lord of the Rings and stuff, but this is historical fantasy and there's some supernatural and there's adventure and, the historical setting, which we all like, Howard was good at it even when he wasn't always accurate at it. It was still, it fit the story. I think Red Shadows is like really good. Bold, insightful comments from Bob Byrne and Robert E. Howard. But I like Kane as you couple. I like El Borak as much as I like Conan. So Kane is kind of over here. This to me is Robert Howard really writing really well and presenting this grand adventure with this character, and the fact that it's basically the third story. I think he nailed Red Shadows. I have much less issue with it than the Argosy editor, but then again, I'm not an Argosy. I the chase of Le Loup. We've all comment before we'll get into the quotes and stuff, but the pre-Africa part, I think very much is Solomon Kane and his vengeance against every evildoer that he runs across. And then you get to the African part. And again, that's that adventure like a Conan tale. I really like Red Shadows a lot. It's my second favorite Kane story, I think. Because I think he achieved something. He went big.
Let me summarize this story to give John just a break from this. Okay. So Solomon Kane is in France. He comes across a dying girl who has been ravished, murdered, life's leaking out, and he leans down and asks, "Who did this to you?" And she says, "Le Loup," which is a French criminal and master swordsman. So Kane hunts the band of thieves that Le Loup leads to extinction, kills them all, and in the cave where Le Loup and the rest of his cohorts have gathered the treasure, Kane confronts them. And I'm giving this the very short version because the way Howard develops it, you're hearing more about Kane before you see them, and you're getting more of the backstory because the bandits are talking about him and how he's hunted them down. And finally, the shadow arrives on the wall, followed by, a corpse arrives, and then there's a shadow on the wall, and Kane's there. And he and Leloup are about to confront each other when the light goes out. The torch is down, everything's dark, and when the light comes back on, Leloup is gone. So that's when the chase begins. But we don't see the chase. The action cuts to Solomon Kane getting off a ship and stepping into the African general. So there's this big transition. And the reader is just like, what's going on here? We were in France, now we're in Africa. And as they tell the story of what happened, all the chapters that we didn't see, Solomon Kane has been pursuing Leloup all across Europe and finally chased him all the way to this wild African coast. And now he's plunging into the jungle just to get this one criminal. And
he tells the ship, if I'm not back in a week, just go on home.
Yeah. So Solomon Kane is captured. And when he's in the hut where he's waiting for whatever they're going to do to him, he meets this very old black witch doctor, Nalonga. And Nalonga says, okay, because he speaks a little bit of English. He used to be a slave in the American colonies. He speaks a little English, and he says, listen, white man, I'm not strong enough to beat these guys on my own, but if we team up together, we can. So, if you'll be my blood brother, I'll help you get your vengeance against the white guy, and you help me get my vengeance against the black guy. So, they sort of agree. And then Solomon Kane is hauled off to the stake with Nalonga, and he sees Leloup has been set up as sort of co-king next to the black chieftain. And again, the racial aspects aren't great here. It's a very traditional pulp tribe. And you would see this sort of thing all the way through the 1960s and 70s in some of the Marvel comics. Just, spear wielding, dressed in grass, huts, all sort of thing. And Leloup goes on about how Kane hunted him and hunted him and hunted him, and now finally the chase is over. He's going to kill him, and they're going to burn them both to death, and that'll be the end of it. Well, Nalonga seems to die, and then a corpse rises. And you can imagine, you're in the middle of an African jungle at night, this corpse rises and shambles forward, and people try to stop him, nothing stops him, and he kills the Black King. And Solomon Kane takes that opportunity to break free, and Leloup escapes, so he chases Leloup. And they finally meet in a glade. And this is one of Howard's earliest opportunities to build up both of these characters as master swordsmen, as resourceful, as practically equal and opposite to each other in worldview, but equal in ability, or near so. So you get this magnificent duel across the glade where finally Solomon Kane wins, and Solomon's exhausted and he's almost on his knees, and then another guy shows up, and it's Grolka the Gorilla Slayer.
Who's built like the Rock.
Yeah. And this is somebody that had not liked Solomon Kane the minute he stepped into the village. He did not like this white guy that was totally fearless. He wants to prove his superiority over Solomon Kane just by killing him. And he's like, okay, I beat the final boss, and now I'm exhausted, and I've got this other challenge.
He doesn't even have his swords in his hand. They're over here on the ground.
Yeah. Defenseless, totally ready to just, and then a gorilla steps into the glade.
It's the giant ape, John.
Yep. Ape counter one.
Ape counter one.
Where's our bingo cards?
And the thing is that earlier in the story, Grolka had killed the giant ape's mate. And now the gorilla's here for revenge.
And hung it up on the wall in the village.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a lot of really interesting themes here, because if you just look at it, it feels like pure pulp. It feels like you've got this world traipsing story, which you only get snippets of, and people are talking about it as if it already happened. And then you get these moments of brilliant action. And then after the set piece, when you think you're going to have the end of the story, the anticlimax, something else happens, something else steps in. And the whole atmosphere that Howard develops in this story is he's playing with the allure of the jungle, and how Solomon Kane feels that pull of darkness and evil, that magnetic attraction to this is something primitive and primal, and you feel it in your soul. You remember this in your DNA. And he does. He feels the call of the jungle. He doesn't answer it at the time, but so that is the short summation. And I think there's some real rough edges to it. The black characters, except for Nalonga, aren't well developed. There's some racial stereotypes to there. They're cannibals, and Groka especially is not described in a way that would be PC today. But they're explicitly like, most of the tribe's okay, and there's these two bad guys, and the bad guys both die horribly. And Nalonga is the one weird element, because he's the shaman, he's the wizard, he's the guy that appears to die on the stake and then animates this corpse to go get his vengeance. And then at the end of the story, he comes alive again. And Solomon Kane has no idea how he's done this. And Nalonga's like, Black Wizard, that's what I do. And that's sort of his character throughout the stories. And through later stories, we get more development of Nalonga. But it's really here that he's established as, I'm the real thing. When you talk about all the mysticism of Africa that you get in these really cheesy pulp stories like Jungle Stories and some of the Weird Tales things, no, I'm the real thing. And it works. It really kind of works. Tim, what did you think?
Oh, and just the story in general, or just the instances with Nalonga?
Whatever.
I mean, I'm in the same boat with Bob. This is one of my favorite Kane stories. It is, like he said, it's epic, like from beginning to end. And this is, I know I said that Skulls in the Stars is an interesting first look at Kane, but this is like the real introduction to him, where that first chapter, I hesitate to even calling it a chapter. It's like a couple paragraphs, where he finds the dying girl on the side in the forest, and she speaks her dying words to him. That's when you get like who Solomon Kane really is, and he sums it up in the last line of that chapter, where all he says is, "Men shall die for this." It's like, oh my gosh, okay, this is the dude. This is the dude we want to follow for the rest of the story. It's awesome, and I love I love every little set piece in this, but if it had just somehow like ended after the cave battle, like he corners Liloop, and then they have this big sword fight, and then he slays him then and there, and the story is over. Even then, I would have been satisfied. But no, it keeps going, and it does spin off into this epic world traveling adventure. And I love how Kane is going on this massive adventure just because he found a dead girl in the forest, and just his sense of justice is so inflamed by the fact that this man would murder this girl and destroy her village. And I know you guys have had Michael K. Vaughan on the show before. He's always touched on the idea that Solomon Kane might be mentally unstable, and that his whole reason for wanting to enact God's justice on the world is just because he has a screw loose. And I can kind of see it with this story. I mean, he literally goes to the ends of the earth to find this dude just to right one wrong. but we love him for it because
when he's fighting with Leloup, I mean, Leloup literally, like you, is like, what? That's
yeah,
why you've been chasing me around? This is
yeah,
what's bothering you because I killed some girl?
yeah,
You'd have to murder me 1,000 times if you did it for all the women that I ravaged. But
yeah.
Leloup can't relate to this sense of why would you do that? The exact way you're talking about, huh? That's pretty excessive.
Yeah, and and Bobby, you put it very well when you mentioned like these two characters, they're equal opposites where Kane is, he is in his eyes, he is God's justice. He understands, that justice has to be done in some way. And he feels like his quest is righteous. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have Leloup, who, for him, as a certain video game dictator once said, for me it was Thursday. That girl I ravaged, that town I destroyed, that was Thursday to me. It's just another thing on my massive list of misdeeds. And so it's these two complete opposites coming together as these two force of wills in this story. And I also love how when he gets captured in Africa and they roll him out into the clearing where they're doing the ritual, you get that scene with Leloup where it reminds me so much of Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indy meets up with Belloc and Belloc is sided with the Nazis, and it's like, oh great, this guy, as if this villain wasn't already the most detestable human being. Of course, he's sided with the guys who just captured our hero, and now he's causing even further trouble for him. I love it so much. You want to see Leloup get it in the end, and he does. But Howard does such an amazing job building up that tension. And yeah, it's just a fantastic, epic pulp story.
Bobby mentioned that they referred to Kane as the wolf in the first movie. Leloup means the wolf in French. So I mean, he is almost equal, like Bobby said. That they've even used a nickname for that was in the earlier story.
Mm-hmm.
I must jump in because if Patrice ever watches this, he will be yelling and screaming at us. He was very particular to say that you pronounce the villain's name Leloup. The E is silent. So for all you folks out there,
we're uncultured Americans,
Ohio, and Patrice is not from Ohio, so it's Leloup.
We're uncultured Americans, John. We can't pronounce these fancy European words.
And Patrice has pointed out in prior panels that we are uncultured Americans. Yes.
Okay.
Really clear on that. Yes.
I think in terms of this story, in 3 movies, it's The Terminator meets Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid meets Apocalypse Now. So you've got this unstoppable killing machine, Solomon Kane, dressed all in black, chasing these Leloup across Europe. And it's sort of like that scene where the Pinkerton men are chasing after Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid all across the West. They're going, who are these guys? Every time they keep showing up after and have to keep fleeing. And then you end up in the jungle at this village. But I thought one of the interesting quotes, another great quote that Solomon Kane makes in this story is after he finally trained or gets Leloup in the cave, he gives I am Solomon Kane. Are you prepared to meet your God? So, sort of used decades later for The Princess Bride, where I am Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepared to die.
There we go.
And
did Leloup have 6 fingers in his right hand?
Don't know.
I thought that scene really fed into the Leloup character, aside from the fact he's just a total bastard, which clearly up to this early point we know. Mm-hmm. But Kane says, "Oh, I'll rephrase it. You're master the devil," as opposed to God. And Leloup's like, "I've done pretty good service for him. I think I've given myself a good accounting when I see him. Although I'm not going to see him now. But that's Leloup. He's almost like a Bond villain in a way to me. But he's smooth." Yeah. And he's willing to be witty and engage in the repartee with Kane.
Yeah.
Who obviously isn't into repartee and wittiness, but
I mean, he knows he's evil, but he's loving it. He loves being evil.
He's owning it. Yes.
Yeah.
And this is a very rare story where Solomon Kane finds somebody who's his equal in swordplay.
Mhm.
He doesn't normally do a formal duel with anyone in the stories. It's just like this one and the Blue Flame of Vengeance. And part of that is because Robert E. Howard did not know how to fence. Uh, yeah, he grew up in Central Texas,
Mhm.
so he didn't have access to any fencing lessons. Very few books or manuals on the subject. He collected swords, but he didn't know exactly how to do sword play. He tried to teach himself once with a friend, and they both took swords, and with some chewing gum, they put little ammo canisters over the tips. And it ended when he stabbed his friend in the hand.
Oh no.
So, he never learned how to do swordplay. So he was mostly getting this from books and handling the swords himself and movies. There's a bit of Errol Flynn in the Solomon Kane stories just in the swordplay. And it's very different than when Conan comes into the page because it's a very different sword. It's a very different style of swordplay. And you can see that in these descriptions of how fast and scintillating the blades were. He's really trying to put all of his energy into making this an exciting description. Not necessarily the most accurate description, but exciting. This is a good action scene, and that's what the Argosy editor realized. This guy knows how to write.
I was gonna, when you went to Conan, I was actually thinking Elborak, that it's a very different for sword scenes than he has with Elborak, which obviously are different from a straight fantasy series sword fight in the first place. So that he's got two very different non-fantasy ways of sword fights.
Hmm.
Uh, I like this quote when Lelou asked him has he been pursuing Lelou, and he says, I have my reasons. And Howard writes, Kane could not have explained, even to himself, nor did he even seek an explanation within himself. A true fanatic, his promptings were reasons enough for his actions. And
Hmm.
as we're going to see further on, I found it extremely interesting that uh, 18 pages into this story in the Del Rey edition, we get this really big explanation of Solomon Kane's character, which is Solomon Kane says that he is doing this to Lelou, and he says, because you are a rogue, whom it is my destiny to kill, answered Kane coldly. He did not understand. All his life he had roamed about the world, aiding the weak and fighting oppression. He neither knew nor questioned why. That was his obsession, his driving force of life. Cruelty and tyranny to the weak sent a red blaze of fury, fierce and lasting, through his soul. When the full frame of his hatred was wakened and loosed, there was no rest for him until the vengeance had been fulfilled to the uttermost. If he thought of it at all, he considered himself a fulfiller of God's judgment, a vessel of wrath to be emptied upon the souls of the unrighteous. Yet, to the full sense of the word, Solomon Kane was not wholly a Puritan, though he thought of himself as such. And but thought that is very interesting, like I said, that you don't really get an explanation of Solomon Kane in this story until it's about midway through the story, where Howard finally says, "This is what he's doing. This is what his reason, as they say in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This is his idiom for what he's doing." And
Idiom.
and most people they probably have done that earlier in the story, but Howard waits till about the middle of the story to explain Solomon Kane's character, and I found that interesting. Um, I thought, let's see, that it was interesting that Lelou is so that, as explained, in the Argosy editor's critique, he said that it suddenly jumps from France to Africa with no explanation, and yet when Solomon Kane confronts Lelou and they're in Africa, you get the backstory where Lelou says, you chased me to Italy, you chased me all across Italy, then you chased me back to, let's see, where else did he, I think it was back to Spain and someplace else before Lulu finally is fled to Africa, and that Solomon Kane, when he first sees Lulu there on the sitting on the dais with the king, he sees that Lulu has been his face has been worn because it's been a years long chase. Several
Mm.
years have occurred in his chasing after Lulu. Um, let's see. Some of the things that you were kind of talking about it, Bobby, about ancestral memories. And Howard was interested in, sort of a believer in ancestral memories and also reincarnation, although really he didn't really talk about reincarnation until after he wrote this story in his letters. But he was a big believer in ancestral memories. And he's got, as you were saying, where Solomon Kane is tied up on the stake and confronted by the chief Sangha and Lulu. And it says he has a flashback to a previous life experience that explained this. And specifically, Howard writes in again, somewhere in his soul, uh, uh, again, somewhere primal in his soul, deep primal urges were stirring, age old thought memories veiled in the fogs of lost eons. He had been here before, thought Kane. He knew all of this of old. All this I have known, somewhere, sometime, thought Kane. Now I am the main actor. And it pops up again as he's watching Gulka fight the gorilla, or actually the gorilla just kill Gulka. He writes again, there that, oh yeah, I've seen this before. Let's see if I can remember that. Again, ghosts of memories whispered to Kane. You have seen such sights before, they muttered. Back in the dim days, the dawn days, when Beast and Beastman battled for supremacy. So that starts making an appearance in his story right here about his ancestral memories and his interest in ancestral memories. Um, let's see. I also thought it was interesting in his writing of the story that he uses the African natives' drums as a recurring motif to give sort
Mm.
of explanations about what's going on in Africa, how Africa is different, how it's a much more a weird paranormal place that white men should not belong in or should not come to. Um, and then the final thing that I really liked was the symmetry in the story. You had Solomon Kane chasing after Lulu for the ravishing and killing of the girl at the start, and you have the gorilla chasing after Gulka, tracking him down to kill him for
Hmm.
Gulka's killing of the gorilla's mate. And I thought that was a very nice touch on his writing.
I hadn't thought of
What do
that.
y'all think about all that?
Yeah, there's a lot of themes that reward reflection on here because it's not a simple, straightforward pulp story at all. Uh, and I say that having read thousands of pulp stories at this point, some of them are very rote, and some of them are written down to a very low audience. It's like if a 12-year-old or 13-year-old picked up the magazine, they can read the story straight through and understand exactly what's going on all the time. And the reader, repeats everything 3 times. If you get somebody that's 10 or 12, they can read pretty much any Doc Savage story or G8 story you're ever going to read to them. This one takes a bit of thought. That leap from the cave in France to Africa, that's what caught up that Argosy editor. That's where he stumbled. That's where he said,
Mm.
okay, we're going to lose readers right here. Because it's a big conceptual leap. You have to have the faith that the reader is going to say, okay, I want to see where this is going. Instead of getting lost in, what, did I miss a page? There's really a lot going on here. And I think that's why it's longer than the other stories. The other earlier stories, like Skulls in the Stars and the right hand, the right hand.
Right Hand of Doom.
Yeah. It's a longer story because it needs to be a longer story, because the characters need that build up because there is that greater introspection into who they are and what they're experiencing and what they did. And it still feels like a truncated novel, because if he had expanded out each of those chapters to show instead of tell, this would have been 100,000 words. And, he wasn't going to be able to sell that, but he could sell something much more compact that gets to the action beats quicker. And the only weird bit is when Nalonga reanimates that corpse. He's got some lovely mystic language in there about what Africa feels like, but there's only that one little weird bit in the entire story. And that's kind of typical of the Solomon Kane sales. Like, there's only generally one little weird bit. He doesn't pack these full of fantastic creatures and strange monsters and stuff. There's like one bit of magic, one haunting, one ghost or wizard or spell or one thing that Howard encounters at a time. And that's enough. There is one exception to that, Hills of the Dead, but we'll get to that in another video.
Tim, you have anything you want to say?
Well, when you initially sent that, when you sent me my homework for this video, John, when you sent me that letter that the editor of Argosy had written to Howard, I understand that that guy was being super generous, out of the thousands of submissions that magazine got at the time, he's taking the time to write back to Howard and give him a critique. But as I'm reading that, I'm thinking, what is this guy talking about? Well, he's like saying, oh, you can't switch up styles like that. You can't have, a huge jump in distance and time like that. You can't switch, from more medieval aesthetic to, African mysticism and stuff. And I'm thinking, what is this guy talking about? This is fantasy. And I'm thinking in my head, is Howard so groundbreaking at this point? Is his work so cutting edge at this point that this was such a shock to people back then who were so inundated with the typical kind of pulp fiction? Because I don't know, reading that letter, it's just like, I don't know what this guy's talking about. It sounds like a perfectly reasonable set of circumstances for a story to have. But I don't know. It's just that letter kind of got to me. I was like, oh man.
I think you're probably right in terms of, especially the state of writing at that time, popular writing at that time. This was sort of like a new thing, probably with something that the people who would read weird tales would be kind of used to, but anybody who was not a weird tales reader, especially Argosy, they would not have seen something like this before. And they was like, oh, whoa, this is interesting, but it just breaks all these rules that all the literature that we accept and that's been the norm for the last 20, 30, 40 years, have established. So I think it was a good trailblazer. You have any thoughts, Bob?
I was just going to share one of my. Oh. So I've got three of them. So we'll do one at each stage, but that's one of the Gary Gianni
nice
autograph posters I got at Windy City last year, which Gary was there kindly chatting with people while he signed. But and he was and Tim, he was doing 5 of his posters, of which one's much bigger than this, and these were the sizes. So it was I think it was 2 Conan and 3 Solomon Kanes it was like $30, $35. It was, and he was chatting and he was talking and he was signing. He let you pick which ones you wanted. He was super nice, but I mean, these are awesome. It's the artwork. The 3 Solomon Kanes are all from the Del Reys.
Yeah. We just get the black and white version in this book.
I think this is a good story to pull people in. This and I think Skull actually is pretty good too. But I think this is one of the better ones to read early for somebody that's not into Solomon Kane yet.
Yeah. Well, and it gives by introducing Nalonga, it does something interesting in giving a reoccurring character, because he shows up in multiple other Solomon Kane stories after this, and
he also in 2 and mentioned in another.
Yeah, but it also does something kind of interesting in that I don't know. I still have yet to finish every single Solomon Kane story, but it introduces an element that I know gets brought up again and again in these stories, where Kane constantly has his view of the, like, his very strict puritanical, literally puritanical view of the world, kind of shaken by all the supernatural things that happen to him. And the fact that Nalonga is literally, he's this magician who seems to be using necromancy to raise people from the dead, animate lifeless bodies to perform for him, essentially. You'd think that seeing
That's not
something like that
biblical. Yeah, that's not biblical. That's
no, that would shake a Puritan to their core. And it's something that reoccurs multiple times in the Kane series, where if he encounters something like this, it challenges his worldview. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing for Howard to introduce to one of his characters.
I will tell you guys that I solved Diablo. I played through Diablo 3 with a witch doctor, and Nalonga was the name of my witch doctor. And
nice. There you go.
So I've used Thieves World characters and some Trojan War stuff, but for a witch doctor, that was literally the only choice I looked at. So, and nobody had taken it, surprisingly. These kids today.
They don't know about Robert E. Howard.
Going to Michael Vaughn's claim that that Solomon Kane might be mentally deficient, there is this passage after Solomon Kane has killed Lelou. The trail ended here, and Kane was conscious of a strange feeling of futility. He always felt that after he had killed a foe. Somehow it always seemed that no real good had been wrought, as if the foe had, after all, escaped his just vengeance. That kind of gives a little hint that he's not fully there, and he just enjoys killing too much. But do we have anything else to talk about Red Shadows?
The fight with Lelou, the first one, is kind of a false plateau, and he sneaks out the back, which is fine. But then when he defeats Leloup and kills him, I mean, that's the end of most pulp stories, most adventure stories, and he got the big boss, as Bobby said. But I mean, that's where you end. So then you've got another big boss that comes in, but then you've got a giant NPC monster boss that comes in and kills the big boss. And Kane makes a comment like, "I'm next." I mean, he's staring at the ape after he's killed him, and he's like, now he's going to kill me. When? And then he just picks up and goes off. Yeah. But you've got a couple of points where this story could have ended, and Howard kept it going, which I think it obviously fed into the length of it. But he wanted to do more with it, I guess, and he wasn't just going to end it at a point that he could have.
He just wanted to throw in a giant ape, and I can't blame him for it.
We had an encounter during the Conan 3 that we did, because boy, there's a lot of giant apes popping up in those Conan stories.
Yeah.
Some of them with wings.
And
get to that later.
And
the ape is very much symbolic, because it is close to human but not human. It's an animal. It's the core of savagery, and a lot of the racism at this time made out black people to be savages, animalistic. And when you look at the black people in this story, Nalonga's not like civilized, but he's intelligent, he's witty, he's wise, he's clever. Sangha, he's commanding, he's evil, he's a cannibal, but he's in charge, he's intelligent, he's strong. He just can't fight a corpse. He can't fight the undead. Grolka is very animalistic in how he's portrayed. He's got the most stereotypical appearance with the thick lips and the brutish muscles, and he's such a savage hunter. And then he goes up against a genuine king of the jungle, man mountain of a gorilla, and the gorilla's like, no, I'm the real deal. So you get this terrific juxtaposition between the merely human savage and the true wild animal. And the wild animal has a degree of majesty that the black characters in this, the bad ones, don't get. And that's very specific, I feel. I really do think that Howard is drawing a comparison between human and animal and civilized and savage, and how thin the line is between the two. But then there's just this gulf between, okay, you may think you're the primal thing of the jungle, but here's the real thing. And it's just so much beyond you. And that's an experience that he wanted Kane to have, to see that up front, to confront that, and not to fight it.
Yeah.
The jungle lets Kane live.
All right. Anything else? Let me go ahead then and end this with two excerpts that Howard wrote to Clyde Smith. This was right after he got the letter back from the Argosy. And he wrote to Clyde, he said, "Strange thing, I had a long manuscript with the Argosy All story, and last night I dreamed that I got it back together with a long personal letter from the editor written in pen and ink. Sure enough, I did. He said in some places the story was very good and in some places rotten. He says that I have the stuff if I get steered right, so therefore he is giving me the good. He is giving me the reasons it was turned down in detail. He did, very concisely and very clearly. He says as the setting was the Middle Ages, I had too much Eugene O'Neill jungle stuff in the story. He's not accusing me of plagiarizing. The main reason for non-sale was unexplained miracles. The reason for this is I wrote this story for the Weird Tales originally, and then decided to try my luck with Argosy All story just as it was. So if a despised weird tale whose whole minor tone is occultism can create that much interest with a magazine which never publishes straight weird stuff, I don't feel so much discouraged. He apologizes for having kept the manuscript so long, saying that he wished to write me a personal letter and therefore kept the manuscript on his desk 2 weeks because before he found time. He says they have been getting about 100 manuscripts a day. He says that the last of the letter, everything I've quoted here in his own words, I mean everything in quotation marks, you seem to have caught the knack of writing, good action and plenty of it into your stories. If you guard against the faults I have outlined, I believe your stuff will be saleable and will be interested in seeing some of it. Good luck." Then next month, March 1928, again to Clyde Smith. The Weird Tales took that manuscript the Argosy editor commented upon, offering me $80. The Weird Tales editor took it in its original form, for I didn't change it any, in spite of the defects pointed out by the Argosy editor, and says that he thinks he'll give me the front page and cover illustration. He asked me to change the title Solomon Kane, however, as I can't seem to think of a good title. Farnsworth did change it to Red Shadows. So,
Red Shadows is a better title than Solomon Kane, as far as I'm concerned. So, Bobby. I mean, story Conan, Solomon Kane, El Borak. No, you got to have a little more to a title.
well,
Solomon Kane, Red Shadow, or yeah, Red Shadows.
Starring in.
Yeah, there you go.
No Red Shadows in the whole damn movie. There's no Red Shadows in the story.
That's true.
I kind of like,
The
as
blood.
Kane referred to, or as referred to in the story, that should have been the title, The Scourge of the Unrighteous,
Mhm.
Be a name of the collection.
Yep. All right. Next, we have Rattle of Bones. We have two drafts for this story in our collection. The second draft only consisting of one page. Um, Anybody want to talk about this? Bob, I think you like this story a lot.
This is actually my favorite Solomon Kane story, and I don't think it's necessarily the best, but it's my favorite. So Kane is going through the forest, and I always get Black Forest. I always think Dark Forest, but and Howard's forest. It's Mirkwood. It's not Lothlorien. I mean, that's the Black Forest in Germany is not a nice forest in Sherwood. So it's Robert E. Howard. So that's fine.
Yeah.
So Kane's going through the forest and he meets another traveler named Gaston Lenormand. Pierre beat me up on that. Patrice, I mean. Um, and they travel together. And you just know that Kane is not chatty and all that while they're walking. And this guy wears plumes, a bright color, so you've got the contrast, which I like. He's very understated, but I like that he put that in. And they get to an inn, and it's just the surly, grumpy innkeeper that has no social skills that is not uncommon in these kinds of things. He lives in the forest. Um, and Kane is of the I've seen you before to Gaston. To Gaston, I think he does it twice, and Gaston just kind of brushes it off and changes the subject. Um, but I think I know you. Ah, well. So they end up getting a room together, and again, the innkeeper's just this crusty German guy. I think when I was rereading it, I think they don't even give his name. He's just the host throughout the
Yeah,
whole
it's never
thing.
given.
So I mean, that's classic NPC, I guess. Um, so they end up sharing a room together, which it seems to me in this completely deserted inn in the in the Black Forest, they could have had their own rooms, but that's just it sets up. Um, and they go in the room, and the room does not have the classic bar to put across to keep the door closed, which of course is a huge thing in Man-Eaters of Zambula, but in a different way. But that bar in the so Kane sort of tells Gaston, I sleep with my saber ready, my rapier ready, so just know. And they decide to go look and see if they could find maybe a bar in one of the other rooms. And this again, kind of like a play. It's a very enclosed story. But again, it feels different than Right Hand to me. So they go looking around upstairs in this, otherwise deserted inn in the middle of the Black Forest. And they find a room and they look in the room and there's a secret passage in there or door in the room, which of course, why not? And there's a secret room behind the room and they find a skeleton chained to the floor in this secret room. Nothing good is going to happen at this point, obviously. It's Robert E. Howard to begin with, and it's a deserted inn, and now you've got this chained skeleton.
It's
And
typical German in decor.
yeah, it's got that Grimm's fairy tales again.
Yeah.
Aesop's. So Armand decides this is the time to get the drop on Kane, and he pulls out the sword on him and gets the advantage on him. And it turns out Garmon is a blackguard. No stunning surprise. And suddenly Kane remembers who he is now that he's being faced by being killed, possibly
Well, no.
left in this room, deserted room. Good.
He recognized him once Gaston removed his hat, which
Uh, and that's really, it's like Superman's glasses, right?
Yeah. The hat
So,
makes the man.
the hat makes the man. That Michael Vaughn would tell you that. That's partly.
Yes, he would.
Yeah. So it looks bad for Kane, and he doesn't see, he's assessing his chances. And it was kind of like when he knew he couldn't get to the two rapiers in the last story before I forgot his name already. Not Gronk.
Lalu. No, the
Okay.
Gulka.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
And Kane seems to be at disadvantage a lot when you look at these early stories now that I think about that. But and I'm sorry, what I had forgotten, and to me, this is really laying the thing down is that that the skeleton was there and Gaston like kicked it and lorded over it that it's dead skeleton there, and Kane is like, don't do that. Bad things happen when you don't respect the dead. And
Well, he cut the chain.
cut the chain, and which that fits in. And it's perfect Kane, but it's also like really. But I mean, it fits and it obviously feeds in the story, but it's very much again Kane's puritanical view of just no, don't do that to that skeleton. Which I don't think anybody else that would be their natural response in the situation they were in, finding it in the room. But as things go, Kane still doesn't have the advantage, and it turns out that the I just got lost.
All right. The innkeeper
Innkeeper,
kills Gaston.
yeah, shows up and kills. Yeah, why did I think that was the? No, yeah, he kills Gaston. Get come on. And it turns out the innkeeper is he's a mentally damaged man. I think that's a fair assessment. he had been a prisoner during wartime and had been treated very, very badly, and he lost his mind. And he's not, again, it's sort of like the necromancer. He's not a good guy. But he had killed Garmon, and he's going to kill Kane and keep whatever gold he can take from the bodies. But we learned that the skeleton that's in the room had been a wizard, not a necromancer, but a wizard or sorcerer, I guess.
Sorcerer.
But, sorcerer. To a D&D player, old school, they're magic users. But regardless,
They're born with magic. They don't learn it.
there you go. And clerics can't use swords, but again,
Exactly.
wizards. Yeah. So he had chained this guy to the wall, this wizard and sorcerer, sorry, and he died in that room. And the wizard, no, go ahead, take over. I've lost it. Good.
Okay. So here's the thing: the host of the Cleft Skull Cavern killed the Russian sorcerer first, but the sorcerer had promised vengeance on him. His bones would take vengeance.
Right.
So the host chains the skeleton into the secret room.
Sorry, man, I missed that. Sorry.
Gaston frees the skeleton and says, "You may go where you will." And, Solomon Kane thinks this is very irreligious and in bad faith to, mock the dead. So after the host kills Gaston, there's a little fight. The host ends up in the secret room, and his neck breaks.
And I mean, doesn't he literally like get pulled into the room?
He gets pulled back into the room.
And you're like, what the hell just happened there?
Yeah.
So this is, when you look at this thing from the outside, this is a slasher movie. It's set up like a slasher movie with two slashers.
Mm-hmm.
But then you've got the supernatural twist at the end. And it's the only supernatural bit in the entire story is at the very end when the skeleton
takes kind of a big supernatural bit, though.
It's a big one, but it's a slow buildup. You hear the rattle of the bones, but you don't see the skeleton move. You don't hear the ghost of the sorcerer whispering vengeance. You're only just getting these tales from the host. And Solomon Kane, who is the only guy that hasn't killed anybody in the entire story, for once.
Twice.
Yeah, you guys keep calling him a murder hobo. I'm not seeing a lot of it here in the early stories.
Solomon Kane ends up being the witness to two oaths being fulfilled, because Gaston promised that whoever killed him, he would come back and be his death, and the sorcerer promised that his bones would take vengeance on this guy that's killed him. And that happens. Everybody that's an actual murderer in the story dies. But this is a very fun story. This is one that I think would go very well if they ever did a small film adaptation of like an anthology of Solomon Kane stories, because you could put this in a tight 30 minutes. And it would be really great tension build up. If you got good character actors, they really nail this one. But it's just a very straightforward little slasher with a couple twists in it.
I think there's more to this than there is to Right Hand of Doom. Even though they're about 2 pages apart, I think there's a much more to this story. Even though Kane doesn't kill anybody, which, I mean,
You have anything, Tim?
Well, I agree. I agree with what Bob's saying. I think there is a little bit more in this, a little bit more substance. I think the atmosphere of this story is a lot better than in Right Hand of Doom. He sets the stage very well, it taking place in this dark forest. And, as soon as they walk into this tavern, it's like, okay, something bad's going to happen. The innkeeper's being shifty, things are just, they're not going to play out. This isn't going to be just a rest stop where they get to go on their merry way the next morning. There's something that's going to go down in this scummy little tavern.
Just if I can interrupt you there, why would you think anything nice would happen in a place called the Cleft Skull?
Exactly.
in the middle of a forest. Yeah.
But yeah, it's not one of my favorite Kane stories, but it's a fun one. It's a fun little little weird tale. I don't know if did this one ever actually appear in Weird Tales, or was this
Yes, it did.
okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
This was the third one published, I think.
Okay, yeah, because it's
June
just yeah,
1929.
it's just a fun little another fun little side quest, I think.
Side quest.
Now, one of the things that may be underpinning why this story feels like a whole lot more than the right hand of doom is that Howard liked legends, he liked stories, and one of the things that he liked that he wrote in a letter to H.P. Lovecraft was the murdered traveler story. So he
Mm.
talked about the murdered traveler story. So here you have the murdered traveler story. And he returned to this theme again for, as Bob mentioned, Guests in the Hoodoo Room, which was, he also turned into the Man Eaters, or actually Man Eaters of Sambula, which was from Guests of the Hoodoo Room. One of his Steve Harrison, or no, that's not a Steve Harrison. One of his weird menace, minute, help me out. One of his weird menace
Occult
stories that
detective
he
stories.
wrote. And then also you can see it in the horror story Pigeons from Hell,
I was just about to
where
say, yeah, tiny
where you
a
have
tiny
the
bit in Pigeons from Hell, yeah.
yeah.
I've got a bunch of Victorian era and up to about the 1930s true crime books because that's part of my Sherlock Holmes and my pulp stuff. The murder traveler thing in Kansas and Oklahoma, and I think there's a couple of Missouri. There's a lot of that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not just urban legend stuff. That was
Yeah.
those little way stations or the houses, the little restaurants where families were killing people and taking their stuff and then disposing the bodies. Howard was hearing about that stuff and seeing that stuff obviously in Texas. So that's a
Yeah.
thing or was a thing.
Yeah, yeah. He
Yeah.
wrote about the murder ranch nearby Cross Plains where they the people who owned the ranch would take in drifters and have them work the ranch with a promise of paying them for their months of work. And then once they got the work done and the person started saying, well, I'm ready to get paid, that they get murdered.
Oh,
And so he talked about that in a letter to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft said, hey, you should write that story up. But,
yeah.
it probably showed up in possibly the Guests of the Hoodoo Room and the Man Eaters of Zambula. Um, see, he also Howard was also a big fan of Bullfinch's mythology, and you got the Greek myths of, I guess it was Heracles and Procrustes, who had the bed that he would put travelers in, and would either stretch them to fit the bed or cut them off to fit the bed. And there was one other, I think Theseus may have done something, had a murdered traveler story involved with him, if I'm remembering correctly. Um, kind of like the interplay between Gaston and Solomon Kane, where he says, Solomon Kane says, I don't like the looks of our host. I think we should find some way to bar the door. And Gaston says, you are timorous, monsieur. And Solomon Kane replies, I like not being murdered in my sleep. That's a pretty good
Little heavy
law to
hand
keep in
there.
mind.
Kane
Solomon
knows
Kane
what's
is
up.
very genre savvy.
That's what I was just about to say. He knows what's up.
And let's see.
I still just like to. I've seen you before. Generally speaking, it's like trying to blackmail a murderer and all these shows you watch. Like, not a good idea. Stop pointing that out. Stop telling him you've. It's not like you saw him on TV or the convention or something. Stop pointing out that you've seen this guy and probably not great circumstances, but
And certainly, don't you would expect Solomon Kane not to turn his back on somebody that he doesn't fully trust, but
I mean, and a Frenchman no less. I mean, come on, you got a British guy and a French guy here. We know how that works.
Oh wow, yeah. A Puritan and a Frenchman walk into a tavern.
Yeah, exactly. You got another joke here.
Yeah.
and let's see. We have anything else? Oh, I like the
Did oh good.
Solomon Kane asked the host if he gets many guests, and he says, few come twice. So
Yeah, yeah. That's
again, cleft skull, few come twice. I think
He's
I'd
laying
probably
it on
say,
heavy.
maybe it's not so bad sleeping out on the trail.
What's the worst that could happen in the Black Forest?
Yeah.
even when he describes, the torture and the punishment that this guy got, there's still no sympathy for him. For me, at any point in the story, from he's a butthead, the innkeeper in the very beginning, and obviously when he talks about murdering the Russian guy, even though he was tortured as a prisoner and it broke him, there's Howard chose not to make this guy sympathetic in any way, I think.
Yeah.
Not really. There is I don't want to say a folk horror, but there's a folksy element to this because it's got sort of that Texas Chainsaw Murder vibe. It's just you have the isolated tavern, you know, you've got all these bad signals, and the readers are picking up on this. They know something's going to happen. It's only a question of what and when. And Howard still manages to surprise you because he saves it. He savors the moment. He builds the tension, and then there's the betrayal, and then there's the betrayal, and then there's the culmination of the yell. So he's setting up these little climaxes for the reader.
Kane doesn't do any of it.
Not really. But it's got sort of that Bates Motel feel, but it's much more backwoods, I guess I would say. It's really got that element of this is something off the beaten path. Stereotypes in this one, there's the national stereotypes a bit because you got the French brigand and you've got the German renegade and you've got the Russian sorcerer. And you wouldn't normally think today that Russians would be associated with black magic. But if you go back to 19th century weird fiction and ghost stories, that was a trope, was the Russian sorcerer or the Russian with the book of black magic, especially in French tales because, Napoleon invaded France. So they started writing these tales where, there's a Russian soldier and he's got a book of black magic and he's reading in his tent and summons all these devils. And, Howard hadn't read all of those, but he knew of those stories. And that's why he made it a Russian wizard trapped in the Cleft Skull Tavern. So, genre savvy all the way down, really.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was also interesting that Howard kind of paraphrased, the famous "Men shall die for this" and Red Shadows. He's got Solomon Kane when they see the murder room, and he says, "Men have died in here." So I thought that was kind of interesting and cute too, especially to read them so close together like that. Anything else we have to say on Rattle of Bones?
I just like that after Gaston kicks the skeleton, and Kane tells him, "Have done, no good will come of mocking the dead." And Gaston replies, "The dead should defend themselves."
And he's right.
And they do.
All righty. Last note that Howard wrote to Clyde Smith: Rattle of Bones, No Thought, Solomon Kane, Bandits, Maniacs, Ghostly Vengeance, as usual. So
as usual, as per. Yeah.
He really shortened up the Cliff Notes type approach to things, didn't he?
Yeah. The last story we'll be looking at tonight is the fragment that he didn't finish. We have actually two drafts I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. We only have one incomplete draft that exists for Castle of the Devil. Anybody want to take this?
I don't even think this is an incomplete draft. That's fragment's a good word for the 4 pages, 3.5 pages of Castle of the Devil. There's not much here.
Yeah, Solomon Kane is still walking through the Black Forest, and he comes across a writer who's also an Englishman, and they start talking. And Solomon Kane mentions, I'm a wanderer on the earth. I've got no occupation, but, sometimes I do a good deed. I cut this poor boy down from a gibbet. And the guy in the horse goes, you robbed Baron von Taylor's gibbet? God, we should all, we got to get out of here before this guy finds out. And Solomon Kane's like, nah, I kind of want to meet this guy who hangs, youths. And he finds out that the guy lives in the Castle of the Devil. And Solomon Kane's like, all right, yeah, I got to go there and see this guy. The other guy's like, well, this might be suicide, but, this sounds fun. Let's go do it. And that's where it ends.
And even just like John saying like, whoa, you're just going to go face him yourself. And he's like, that's what I do. I mean, literally.
Ramsey Campbell wrote a story based on this fragment, and Dark Horse Comics did comic book adaptations of it. Marvel did comic book adaptations of it. So it's a nice jumping off point for however you want to do it, but they always end up doing it, very differently because the whole rest of the story remains to be written. But it's a nice setup to what you don't see in a Solomon Kane story, which is the buddy comedy. This is a buddy cop comedy with Solomon Kane and John, the other Englishman, who's very garrulous and happy. And I think that was a dynamic that Howard wanted to write in a story because he tried it a couple of times. He tried it in The Castle of the Devil. He tried it in another fragment called Hawk of Basti. But he never quite gets it to work. He can write the dour Puritan fine. He can write a happy-go-lucky, irreverent adventurer type, but playing them off against each other, I think, got tiresome for him because he could never quite manage to do it for an entire story. Somebody can tell me I'm wrong about that, but it just seems like it's something he tried a couple times and never really mastered.
Tim, you have anything to say?
I mean, it's one of those things where it's a fragment, but what little we have of it is so interesting to the point where I really wish he would have finished this one because it's such a cool setup. Bobby, like you were saying, it could have been this awesome, like, buddy road trip sword and sorcery adventure story. And I do love how he cuts this young boy down from the gibbet and John tells him, how could you do this? He belongs to the Castle of the Devil, and immediately that's all he had to say. And Kane's immediately like, Castle of the Devil, you say? Well, clearly this is a job for Solomon Kane. Da, 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 da. It's
let us look into the matter.
Yeah, exactly.
It all.
Yeah. He's like, I watched a skeleton kill a guy last week. I can take on anything at this point.
And I like some of the quotes further explaining Solomon Kane's motivation. It's Solomon Kane says, I am a wanderer on the face of the earth and have no destination. Wherever the spirit moves me to go, just now I find myself in this wild and desolate country through which I journey, doubtless hither drawn for some purpose yet unknown to me. All he's waiting for is, it's Baron von Stalling, and it's the Castle of the Devil. And he's like, there!
Yup, there we go.
Have you
further
guys
on it says, sir, what matters it where a man be if he is carrying out God's plan for him? So it's kind of a little bit Calvinist there for him for his Puritan aspects, but
Have you guys read the Dark Horse comic of this?
Yeah.
I read the first one and never got around to picking up the rest of the issues on it. So
it's dark. That's really what I took out of that. The Baron is kind of isn't he like worshiping an earth god type thing? And it's sort of a bad earth god. And these are like, this one kid is just one that he's putting crosses up around on the land. And it's a very earth German kind of thing is what I remember from that. And
it's very weird. They were deliberately going for something very, very strange because the Marvel comic had been much more prosaic, where the Baron was born deformed, and they were trying, he was trying to make sacrifices to Satan to give himself a proper leg. But the Dark Horse comic is a lot weirder because they had better artists to do it. one thing about this one, I want to say this about all of Howard's fragments. Even when he did not finish the story, the fragment gave Howard a chance to experiment with developing the character. And that often feeds into the next story or future story. So, even if these episodes were never complete, they're still in the back of Howard's head and they still go on to, and they're sometimes referenced in further stories up the line. We don't really hear of Howard in, the Castle of the Devil and any of the future stuff. It's not mentioned in Solomon Kane's Homecoming or anything, but the whole thing where he mentions he'd been to sea, that started here,
Yep.
more or less.
And it,
It's in the fragment. He said, "Oh yes, I was a seaman, and they became nothing more than a bunch of bloody pirates." Yeah, that goes right into
even
all
the
the
whole
other.
they call themselves honest merchantmen, but they're not, but bloody. So it's again, it's Solomon Kane's Puritan righteousness when he's discussing not just their pirates, they present themselves as noble, and you got a feeling he was out there also taking people out on the water the same way he's taking them out on the land or trying to.
Yeah. And that echoes very much the Blue Flame of Vengeance and parts of the Moon of Skulls and some of the other stories. It's just
Is Blue Flame the one that became Volmia? The Volmia story?
no. You're thinking of Black Stranger and
I want to
Well,
say it's Brotherhoods of the Blade is I think is what
Blades of the
yeah,
Brotherhood.
Blades of the
All right.
Brotherhood. Yeah.
The
yeah.
Blue Flame of Death became Blue Flame of Vengeance, became Blades of the Brotherhood with
Okay, so
Malachi Grimm, which was then published as Blades of the Brotherhood with Solomon Kane. It's got a very complicated history, but yeah, Terrence Volmia is another of Howard's pirate characters who came in later after Solomon Kane. We'll go into that another time, not with this story.
we already talked about Black Stranger, so I'm happy with that, as we know. So
Uh,
Uh,
um,
another quote going into Solomon Kane's motivation. It has fallen upon me now and again in my sojourn through the world to ease various evil men of their lives. I have a feeling that it will prove thus with the Baron.
well,
and that's
and that's where silence, like, you speak as if you were a judge on a bench, and then you are but one blade, and the Baron is surrounded by lusty men at arms, and Solomon's like, the right's on my side, and the right's mightier than 1,000 men at arms. Like, again, he doesn't sweat stuff like that.
Yeah.
He is on a cause for what he decides is justice, and that is literally all the discussion or insight that he needs to think about. Whereas the other guy, is slightly more practical, is there's you, there's me, and there's 1,000 men at arms in a castle with the guy, and Kane's just like, don't worry, we're on the right side of this. Silence, like, I think we still need to get in the ship. So, let's go.
Yeah, I should have mentioned the name. All right, so the name of Solomon Kane's companion in this story is John Silence, which was probably, I think, a placeholder because Algernon Blackwood had very famously written a series of stories about Dr. John Silence, an occult detective. So probably Howard liked the name, was just using it as a placeholder until he finished the story and replaced it with something else, because he did that a lot. When you see a lot of characters in Howard stories that have the same name over and over, like there's so many Steve Costigans, there's so many um, Gonzalez and all that sort of stuff. It's because, he put a name in there just to write the story. And then sometimes at the end to sell it, he changed the name. And if it didn't sell, sometimes he changed it again. So like Solomon Kane became Malachi Grimm. Um, Sometimes you get Buckner Grimes, and sometimes you get Pike Bearfield. It's
Ooh.
he plays these little name games because that's what you did in the pulps when you needed to sell a story.
John, you're gonna see when you do your editing that when he said that last name, I went who, but you weren't looking at me when I did that. So Pike Bearfield.
Sorry. Yeah, like I said about it being a buddy comedy, I think it does end with that buddy comedy aspect where, as y'all were saying, John's silence says, you're going to die if you go do this. But it sounds like, let me see what, write down, I say, to 'Tis a wild venture that's like to end in death, but its insanity appeals to me, and no man can say that John Silent fails to follow where another man leads. To which Kane replies, Your speech is wild and godless, but I begin to like you.
That is literally the lightest hearted that Kane gets.
It really is, isn't it?
So that last line, yeah. I like you.
Y'all have any thoughts on how y'all would think the story would have developed?
I think the Baron's going to be pissed.
Oh,
Going
yeah.
to comment through all of it there will be no remorse by Kane, and the Baron is going to be, and the Baron might even play it under the table and then sort of string it out. But Kane is going to be in peril from the Baron, who I think might be kind of playing both sides. That's more of a character than just him being obnoxious and powerful. But if he's putting guys up on crosses, somebody who takes those crosses down it's war. I think that's going to be.
The Baron's like, how did those get there? I've been telling them to stop putting those in my yard.
He kind of in the Dark Horse, doesn't he? He's sort of like, oh well, we should get that stopped.
Oh, really?
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're a good guy. So that's kind of yeah. He's not very.
Robert Howard never heard of Chekhov's gun, but he does not name something the Castle of the Devil and not have a devil.
Yeah,
so I think if he had finished this story, there would have been something not necessarily satanic, but there's going to be at least a devil in human form. There's going to be something supernatural because he's going to try to sell this to Weird Tales. It could have gone a lot of different ways. The Baron might have been a werewolf. I don't know. But, for some reason, he's hanging this poor youth. And as far as I know, maybe they get in there, they have a nice dinner, and the Baron tells this long story about, the youth was actually a werewolf and he had to hang him for his own good. And there was a comely maiden involved because you want to try to get on the cover. But, because
get to work.
because he's got that buddy comedy guy with him, something's got to go haywire. Yeah. He's got to have somebody to play off with, and he needs an extra sword. So I think it would have been a lot more complicated if he had finished it, but we don't know. He just didn't leave enough for us to tell.
Yeah, that was the one thing I picked up where he wrote that Kane said, yeah, the kid looked innocent to me, so I took him down off the gibbet. And I'm thinking, what if Howard was thinking about changing it around where the kid was actually the devil and was being hung, and as they're going to find out as he's about to kill the Baron, and the kid breaks in as the devil.
The kid jumps up and stabs him or something.
Yeah. That would have been an interesting story. It's one of those stories that I really wish he had finished. And,
has nobody finished this one?
No. Well,
Ramsey Campbell.
I'm sorry, you did say Ramsey finished. Okay, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. There's also been some guys in Javier Martin Lalanda did a Spanish edition, and Gianluigi Zudas did an Italian edition, but those have never been translated into English, so we don't know how they differ. But yeah, a couple different people have made versions of this story. But
this fragment isn't in the public domain, is it?
No, it's not.
It wasn't published until 1968.
Okay, yeah. I was gonna say, because if it is in the public domain, I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot of different versions of that story sometime soon.
Well, you never can tell. Heroic Signature may decide to see about getting somebody to finish it for us so we could see. So
they could do an anthology. Okay, here's a start. Here's how 12 different authors decide to finish it.
Yeah.
Ooh, there we go.
There you go.
There's a mystery book from it's probably the 80s now, but it's Aston and a bunch of the Florida authors. You know that one, Bobby? And they each did a chapter and handed off the next one. So it would be like James Hall and Carl Hyacin, and I think there's a pulp version of it from like the 30s or 40s as well. But I'm thinking of the Florida one because I know Carl Hyacin, but
or the Kinslayer was a Robert E. Howard fragment that they got like 30 of the best fantasy authors to each write a chapter of it.
Really?
So, yeah. And It's this little paperback. It's not a great story,
Oh,
but
Generally,
the
those other
individual
ones I
chapters,
mentioned that, yeah, 20 different people write or 12 people writing a book, a chapter at a time each, does not automatically cohesive to, yeah.
yeah, the whole round robin concept does not make a good book, but the individual chapters get interesting because you
I'm
get
sure.
like Frank Belknap Long turns it into a werewolf, and uh, who was it? Marion Zimmer Bradley gives him a wife and a kid, and it just gets weird. But it's fun. There's progress.
Hmm. Well, I believe, unless anybody has anything else to say about Castle of the Devil, that is the end of that. And do we have any thoughts so far on these first 5 stories in the Del Rey book? Bob, what are your thoughts?
I think Kane got off to a good start. I mean, I've mentioned before, I'm not the biggest Cole fan or Bran McMorn, and we all like different levels of Howard. But I read the Cole stories and they've grown on me a little. But I mean, they didn't grab me like Alborak and they didn't grab me like Conan, obviously. I, I read Kane and I'm like, these are neat. And we talked about these individual pieces, and right hand is what it is, and there's not much to Devil. But you guys are even saying that you can see it going certain directions. I think maybe the fact that he had created Kane and went away and came back, he had a better concept of what he wanted with Kane. Those early El Boraks. Where is my the early El Boraks from the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press. This is how I keep getting back on these things. I keep plugging the Foundation books. The
You don't
El
have the
Borak.
new version? You don't have the new Ultimate
No,
version?
what I was gonna. Well, no.
I don't either, but it's because
But
they keep
the
selling
early
out before.
oh, that's true. I do have the old one. I do have the new Steve Harrison. We know what I think of Harrison.
Yeah.
The early El Borak stories to me, I mean, that's a very different character. Not to me, that is a different character. And El Borak came back, and I think it's amazing, but it's not where he started with El Borak. I haven't seen, what he wrote in high school of Kane, but I think Kane comes out of this as a pretty full-fledged character. And I think the stories from the start, on the jump are good. Maybe not great or as great, but I thought it's a better start than when I read the Cole stories for me.
Hmm.
Bobby?
Well, Tim, what did you think?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this was the Del Rey set was my first introduction to Kane, and I mean it blew me away because when I first started getting into Robert E. Howard, I was like, okay, I love the Conan stuff, but is this guy a one-trick pony? And then I get to Solomon Kane, I'm like, oh no, he's good, okay, cool. And so yeah, these first 5, even if that last one is just a little fragment that doesn't go anywhere, it's quality fantasy slash swashbuckling adventure slash horror slash sword and sorcery. It's darn good stuff. Um, I will say that I was a bit disappointed that we didn't talk about my favorite Kane story, but I don't know. But
Well, that's coming up, at some point, I plan to do a series of these to
okay,
slowly work our way through the Solomon Kane book.
I was gonna say, because if you guys would have me back, I will ramble on and on about.
We'll have our double secret probation vote after the call when you're off.
Okay, yeah, exactly. If you guys decide to have me back, I will go on a tangent about Moon of Skulls. I love that freaking story to death. But these first 5, they're still quality stuff. And this was really before I think he hit his stride, because this is still in the late 20s, correct?
Yeah.
Late
Yeah,
20s, early 30s for the later stuff.
This is before he really hit his stride with Conan and the repeated hits at Weird Tales magazine. So yeah, it's further proof that he was just on it back in the day. It just like I said, super cutting edge author. Every time I read a new series or a new character from Howard's bibliography, it's like, man, this guy could tackle anything. Even when the stories aren't particularly to my liking, I still think he does an awesome job with any kind of type of story or genre that he decided to set his mind to.
Bobby?
Okay. So of these 7 published Solomon Kane stories during Robert E. Howard's lifetime. These include the first three. And these are grouped together at the beginning of the Del Rey edition, more or less geographically, as we said. These are the more European tales. And that's important because, Howard's still writing other things. He's writing historical adventure, he's writing sports, he's playing with what we would call sword and sorcery with the Shadow Kingdom that came out in 1929. So, like, right after the Rattle of Bones, he was publishing the Shadow Kingdom, and then he starts to write some more Solomon Kane stuff, and there's this gap between the very early Solomon Kane stuff and the later Solomon Kane stuff, because the later Solomon Kane stuff is mostly set in Africa. Solomon Kane goes back to Africa twice. And those later run of stories are, I think, the most memorable and the best of the Solomon Kane stories. These are solid. These are interesting stories. They're a great introduction to the character, but they're playing with genre. They're playing with convention. He's got a good handle on the character, but he's still trying to find, what's the magic formula so that I can sell these regular two weird tales. And I think he hasn't quite hit the magic yet, because once he gets Solomon Kane back in Africa, those are the really special stories that start to come out. So this is really him feeling out the character, feeling out the genre. How far can he go with horror? How far can he go with adventure? And once he really does hit his stride, he goes for both. So there's some really interesting stories coming up, but this is your introduction. This is where Howard's figuring out what he can do with Solomon Kane starting out. And then from here, he goes on to what he wants to do with Solomon Kane, the stories he really wants to tell. And that's where it gets really interesting to me. So this is a great beginning, but he goes so much deeper later on.
I enjoyed the heck, because I was telling Bob earlier that it's been over 20 years since I read Red Shadows. And so I was rereading it for this, and I was just amazed at how well it's written. I remember reading when I first read it, decades ago, I thought it was okay. And when I read the Del Rey book about 20 something years ago, I thought, it's still okay. But reading it again for this, it's like, oh, and just noticing what he did with his writing, the drums carrying information, the symmetry between Solomon Kane and Lalu and Gulka and the gorilla and other things. That is just a very well written story, especially a pulp story for its time. And there's just these tales that he wrote immediately after it. The Skulls in the Stars is okay. It's a good little horror story for what it is. But the others, the Right Hand of Doom and Rattle of Bones, they just don't feel the same after Red Shadows. It's sort of like, if I were to do the book, I would probably put those three stories first and then come in with Red Shadows, so that people are kind of like, well, this is an okay character. And then when you get to Red Shadows, is thinking it's, oh, wow, this guy really is finally coming into his own, as Bobby's saying. But I think it is a very good beginning for the character. And I'll be looking forward to see what we had to say when we go after the other stories over the coming months or so. So,
I have two more thoughts and one on the cover.
yes, sir.
So the staff, the Solomon Kane staff. I don't remember if it was Dabir and Asim or the Ringsworn trilogy, but I was talking to Howard Andrew Jones a couple years ago, and I had just read something, one of those. I honestly can't remember which, but he goes, "So, did you recognize the staff?" And no, I did not. It didn't, whatever scene and it was one of the novels, I think. So, I mean, but it wasn't the short stories. But I'm like, what? And he literally goes, "I'm disappointed in you, Bob." I'm like, well, who isn't disappointed in Bob? Thanks, Howard. But he gave it is Solomon Kane's staff that basically one of his wizards has in. I I'm thinking it was the Ringsworn trilogy, not the Dabir and Asim books, but obviously you guys know, I mean Howard and Howard, but he actually specifically made that it's a reference to Solomon Kane's staff in one of his fantasy novels. And the only, not to rag on Rusty in any way, shape, or form, because he's Rusty, by God.
Yeah.
I don't mind that he used the H.P. Lovecraft intro for this, as the intro to this, and then there's the biography that he wrote, that Rusty wrote about Howard. I love the intros to the Del Rey series. I've gone on about Dave Hardy's, and you've got Patrice's, and there's not a Solomon Kane intro with this. I mean, that
there is.
What? Is it in the Wandering Star?
No, it's all right. So this is H.P. Lovecraft in memoriam Robert Irvin Howard.
Right, but I don't think
August. In August 1928 began the tales dealing with Solomon Kane, an English Puritan of relentless dueling and wrong redressing practice, whose adventures took him to strange parts of the world, including the shadow-haunted ruins of unknown and primordial cities in the African jungle. With these tales, Mr. Howard struck what proved to be one of his most effective accomplishments, the description of vast megalithic cities of the elder world, around whose dark towers and labyrinthine nether vaults cling an aura of pre-human fear and necromancy, which no other writer could duplicate. These tales also marked Mr. Howard's development of that skill and zest in depicting sanguinary conflict which became so typical of his work. Solomon Kane, like several other heroes of the author, was conceived in boyhood long before incorporation in any story.
Yeah, but that's like 14 lines. I'm looking at it out of a 5-page intro. So
Are you saying that Lovecraft should have done more?
I'm saying there should have been an actual Solomon Kane intro to go with this book and the Lovecraft.
He used the word sanguinary and megalithic. What more do you want from him?
Megalithic Conan, not
Eldritch. Eldritch, damn it. We needed an Eldritch stones.
I'm pedantic as hell, but I sort of agree with Bob here. I think he could definitely have used a better introduction.
Or an additional, but that's just me.
Well, there was, I know it's in the audiobook. It might be in the Wandering Star edition, but Gary Gianni has a sort of intro, or foreword at least. Yeah, the foreword by Gary Gianni is probably your best introduction that you're gonna get.
I mean, that's in here, but again, it's that long. I mean, to me, all the Scott Oden and the Howard Andrew Jones intro and afterword in the Sword Woman, they floor me. I think I started writing a Blackgate piece on basically my version of an intro to Sword Woman, like I did with the Steve Clarney stuff. And I reread Howard's thing at the end of the book, and I went, there's no even reason for me to tackle this subject at all. So I gave up, much like I haven't written about El Boric because of Dave Hardy stuff. I think there could be a Solomon Kane intro that, is some of what we've talked about, but a Solomon Kane-centric thing, sort of supplementing the H.P. Lovecraft thing. And I think
remember what Patrice said the Wandering Star books were originally created for. It was by people who wanted to get cinematic people interested in doing movies. So they were just mainly going for the story and the arts to make it look nice and pretty for the illiterate people in Hollywood to figure out what's going on. So they really wouldn't have cared to get a big forward about Solomon Kane and his importance. They were just, here's the stories and here's the art that goes with them. Let's do a movie. What do you guys think?
Yeah, but I mean, look at El Borak, the Three Conans, Sword Woman. Does Call have one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That tells you how much attention I pay to Call. But anyways.
Yeah. Well, it could have been that because the book sold so well in Europe and in the United States that they said, hey, maybe we ought to start doing these pieces at the beginning to explain what's going on and with these characters and give a little more background on the characters and Bob Howard and why he wrote the stories and what he used to write them with. So
maybe that'll be the first post in the Blackgate Solomon Kane series that we'll be eventually some year possibly doing.
After the Breckenridge Elkins.
Speaking of Hollywood,
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, speaking of Hollywood, I only just now noticed that there's a Stephen King quotation on the Del Rey book.
Yeah.
How did I not see that? Oh my gosh, Stephen King gets his name on everything. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
It's not a bad name to have on your stuff, though.
I mean, it's not, but good Lord, dude.
Well, people know Stephen King, so they figure if Stephen
Yep.
King's giving his thumbs up, although he's not really giving a thumbs up to Howard in general.
Well,
But
there's the question for you. Do you think the Dark Tower owes anything to Solomon Kane? Because you think about the gunslinger pursuing the man across the desert,
yeah,
and
Oh.
that's got a Solomon Kane vibe to it.
yeah.
I've only read the first chapter of the first Dark Tower series, so I'm gonna assume that that's correct.
You have read one chapter more than I have, so
Me too.
But on the movie, I'm not going to get into a big thing, but I tell people the Solomon Kane. I think it's a good sword and sorcery movie, but it's not good Solomon Kane.
Yes.
Oh yeah, well,
I don't even think it's a good sword and
See,
sorcery movie.
I enjoy it, but
I lump it in with I lump it in with the Conan movies. The Conan movies are not good representations of Conan, but they're fun fantasy movies.
Yeah, it
depends. I mean, yeah, you get very good. I think the Kane movies okay.
Me. It's a lot of CGI. It's not the right character. They made the damn thing is Purefoy is a beautiful actor for the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's a great Solomon Kane. He's just in this really cruddily written movie.
Yeah.
It wasn't the greatest script, I know. I still think it's okay sword and sorcery movie to watch, but
Yeah.
it's not good Solomon Kane. I don't think anybody thinks it was a good Kane adaptation.
No.
Now that I think about it, do they even take any elements from the stories in that movie?
Being a buccaneer.
I was saying,
yeah.
And he's got a sword, and
they do the thing from A Witch Shall Be Born, and they nail him to a cross.
Well,
That's like the most Howard that's in that movie.
You can't do a Howard movie unless you nail somebody to a cross.
Exactly, yeah.
You don't have a giant ape, you're nailing him to the cross. Those are your two things. All right.
Yep.
With the new Red Sonja movie made by the same person who made Solomon Kane, they've got a crucifixion scene in it too.
Oh gosh.
To be fair, that was in the comics. That
Well,
was in the comics.
Having never read her comics outside of the original Conan the Barbarian issues where they did Shadow of the Vulture, I couldn't disagree or agree with you. So I'll take your word because you've never steered me wrong, Bobby. So, all right, gentlemen, y'all want to talk about any upcoming things y'all have, Bob? Counterclockwise to me. So, Bob.
I still get through the firewall every Monday morning at Blackgate somehow. So I've been doing that for 14 years now. So I don't know how it keeps working, but 12 years, 13 years, I don't know. So every Monday morning there's something that's often lately I've been Douglas Adams. That's been my thing lately. I've jumped back into the world of Dirk Gently and Hitchhikers, but there will be Robert Howard this summer with the pulp stuff, and I did Cimmerian in September. So other than that, I continue to not write the couple book projects that I've been kicking around for a couple years and continuing to not make a further inroads in the Nero Wolfe world. So I just need to quit playing LA Noire, the video game, and I need to spend as much time on the blog and do more writing. So other writing. So
I still got the last two Carstairs and Doan stories to read. So thank you for setting me on to those.
I've got about 2/3 of an essay from like 3 years ago for the Summer Pulp series on the first Doan and Carstairs because I love those books, as you know. So,
Bobby,
I'm still working on the books for Howard Days. I'm hoping to have 2 giveaway books for anybody that makes it to Cross Plains this year. Cross your fingers. These are going to be good ones. I really think these are going to be good ones.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the one that you're having the most trouble with.
Robert Howard related book coming out from Hippocampus Press, but we don't have a date yet. So hopefully sometime this year you'll see something from Hippocampus Press about Robert Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. That's taken me a little while to put together, but it's there if they ever publish it. And other than that, I'm just working on my blog and trying to get paid.
Tim.
Well, I'm also way behind on my writing. I need to finish a half dozen short stories that I've started up over the past couple months. We some friends and I here on YouTube put out an anthology last month called Weird Frequencies, a bunch of pulp stories. It was all edited by Jake from Pulp Mortem. He did an awesome job on that. So I had a story in that, and he announced very recently, I think at the 1st of January, that we're going to be doing a second one this year, as well as a horror anthology that we're going to work on. So I need to write stories for that. He's given me a deadline, and I need to crunch before we hit that deadline. But as far as Howard related things, it's funny that we brought up Red Sonja because, and I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but a friend of mine and I are working on a Red Sonja read along with Red Sonja #1, The Ring of Ikribu, which
who's the writer on that?
That's David C. Smith and Richard L. Tierney.
David C.
Smith's good.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he is.
From what little that I've read of this so far, it's pretty awesome. So I don't know when this project's gonna wrap itself up, but it's gonna be fun. We're doing a kind of deep dive on this.
It'd be nice for somebody to get those back in print. I've mentioned that to David once at Pulp Fest or something, and he just looked at me and I'm like, sorry, I'm
how dare you?
And obviously it's occurred to you in the past. I'm gonna stop. So I'll go back to the back of the room where I'm supposed to be, David. Sorry. But
he
those
just released a new book.
I'm sorry?
David C. Smith. He just released a new book on writing weird sword and sorcery.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, just like in the last month, right?
Yeah.
Didn't DMR put out a new compilation of his Atlantean hero stories a few years ago? Yeah, I can't remember the name of the hero.
He's
but
talked about getting his Oron stuff back in print.
Yeah,
the Barbarian, but that's been slow too.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've met David. Super nice guy. I mean, he's funny and he's cool and just Bobby's staring at me, but David's a good guy and he goes to Pulp Fest and some other stuff. So if you run into him, absolutely talk to him and stuff. He's.
Did you meet him, Bobby, when he was at Howard Days as the guest of honor in 2018 or 19? Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Very nice guy.
There you go, Tim. People you can meet if you make it to Howard Days this year.
I'm going to try. It sounds like a ton of fun.
All right. And
you guys want one funny David C. Smith story before we kick off?
Let's kick off real quick so we can end this so it doesn't go any longer because, again, we've gone almost 90 minutes. Or actually, I think we have gone. It was an F.
Paul Wilson story, but that's fine. Fine. That's okay. It's all right.
Next time.
Yeah, next box.
Okay. So
if I talk less on Rattle of Bones, yes, I know.
So next for us is in the process of doing a special video for the Robert E. Howard birthday coming up on January 22nd. So thank you all, everybody, for coming and watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the like and subscribe. And we will see you again sometime in the future when we start looking at the next few stories in the Solomon Kane book. Thank you all for watching, and we'll talk to you all later.
Do you see Bobby's got a Solomon Kane t-shirt? I literally only noticed that just like 2 minutes ago. I've never seen a Solomon Kane t-shirt. Shirt. That's cool.
Man.
I didn't even see that the entire broadcast.
You didn't bring enough for the class, Bobby? Come on.
Free one at Howard Days? Huh?
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.